June 6, 1942. Are you expecting the Battle of Midway? Well, you got that yesterday. Go watch it if you missed it. Today you get the Battle of Sevastopol and the Battle of Gaza. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, upwards of 250,000 Soviet prisoners were taken by the Germans near Kharkov. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was wounded in an assassination attempt. Britain sent over 1,000 bombers on a raid of Cologne. Erwin Rommel launched a surprise offensive against the Allies in North Africa, and dozens of Japanese ships and tens of thousands of Japanese men made their way across the Pacific to get into position for their attacks this week against Midway Island, the Aleutian Islands, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Now, I already talked about that Pacific action in an extra regular episode, and I will talk more about it tomorrow in another regular episode. There's plenty of other stuff I need to cover today. For example, on June 2nd, the Germans renew the bombardment of Sevastopol, now with Luftwaffe support. The German success at Kerch had cleared the road for a renewed attempt to capture Sevastopol. It was clear from the start that the fighting here would have a totally different character from that on the Parpatch front. Here, there was an enemy prepared for all eventualities, entrenched in a complicated labyrinth of fortifications. And the Soviets had been working all year long to ever better their defenses since the last attempt failed in January. Petrov's coastal army is 7 rifle divisions and 4 rifle and marine brigades, making up over 100,000 men, along with like 600 big guns and a couple thousand mortars. He only has a few dozen tanks and planes, so he's really inferior in the skies, but the Luftwaffe so far has not prevented him being supplied by sea. And the few German or Italian ships in the Black Sea certainly aren't a real threat to cut him off. Because of that lack of Axis naval power, this naval fortress must be attacked by land and by air. By land, it has 3 defense zones, however. One that runs along the Belbek Heights, bristling with field fortifications that runs in an arc down to the coast. An inner belt that runs from the Belbek estuary along the river and then south over the Sapun Heights, also well fortified. And there's a third inner ring immediately around the city. Many consider this fortress to be the strongest in the world, and Erich von Manstein has his work cut out for him in trying to take it. So, in a front just over 30 kilometers wide, he has 7.5 German and 1.5 Romanian divisions for Operation Sturgeon Catch, and 600 pieces of mostly heavy or super heavy artillery, including the 600mm and 800mm Thor and Dora guns. More on them next week. Artillery and Luftwaffe bombardment picked up seriously over the last 10 days of May, but the actual battle for Sevastopol begins now on June 2nd with concentrated air and artillery strikes that last the remainder of the week. Their main purpose, apart from their demoralizing effect, was the elimination of the enemy's artillery and the destruction of the most advanced defenses, and of important infrastructure targets, harbor, airfields, supply depots, etc. Despite great devastation, the attacks on the whole failed to achieve the hoped-for softening up of the enemy's defensive front, so that Hitler for a while seriously considered abandoning the offensive and contenting himself with the continued siege of the fortress. But the Axis infantry is going to attack, and it is going to attack next week. But the Axis are attacking this week in North Africa as the Battle of Gazala continues. On May 31st, Erwin Rommel issues a formal request for Brigadier Hayden to surrender the isolated British 150th Brigade, who are the only real threat to his supply lines at this moment. This is rejected without comment. By the end of the 1st, the 150th has been overrun and Rommel's shortened supply line is secure. This attack is actually a huge assault with major air support. Rommel is leaving nothing to chance. At one point in the fighting, he takes personal command of one of the advanced platoons. Ken Ford writes that it will be noted that it is likely the first time in the war that so small a unit is commanded by so high-ranking an officer. When the end finally comes, along with 3,000 POWs, Rommel goes in to congratulate Hayden on his defense and the skill of his men. But he can't, for Hayden has been killed earlier in the day. 8th Army Commander Neil Ritchie has planned for a big two-pronged attack on the Cauldron from north and east on the 2nd, with the 150th attacking simultaneously, but it's too late for the 150th, and his junior commanders have other ideas, with only one battalion of the 151st Brigade ending up making the attack, which, unsurprisingly, does not reach any of its objectives when launched. Overall Theater Commander Claude Auchinleck warns Ritchie that Rommel might renew the offensive before 8th Army is ready to make its own attacks. But there are now a couple of days of consolidation on both sides, except for the 90th Light and Trieste divisions being sent to clear the Free French out of Bir Hakeim. The fighting there lasts the rest of the week, though, without decision, with the stubborn resistance of the French and their well-placed anti-tank guns and minefields surprising pretty much everyone. Back at the center of the battlefield, Auchinleck and Ritchie were deciding what to do next. Auchinleck favored making a bold thrust out of 13th Corps defense positions and heading for Bir el Temrad in the Axis rear, 16 kilometers to the west of the Gazala line. Ritchie and his corps commanders were against such a move, claiming that they might not be able to hold Rommel's armor while such a bold advance was made. Ritchie decided that the best course of action would be first to crush the enemy's mobile forces contained in the Cauldron. That was exactly what Rommel expected him to do. The plan is for 30th Corps to drive behind the Axis south of Knightsbridge, while 13th Corps would take the Sidra Ridge. After that, the 1st Armored would guard the north and east exits from the Cauldron. 10th Indian Brigade will open a hole in enemy anti-tank positions, and then 7th Armored Division would drive on through. This is Operation Aberdeen, and it gives operational command to Harold Briggs and Frank Messervy in order. It was intended that infantry and armor should fight together. It should also be noted that their functions remained separate. Altogether, it was a complicated plan and fraught with danger, but Ritchie and his colleagues were confident and looked forward to a resounding victory. It kicks off on the 5th, and 10th Indian moves up and takes its objectives. However, Rommel's defenses are further west than expected, so the preliminary artillery barrage doesn't hit them. So when the 22nd Armored Brigade drives through, 156 tanks strong, it advances 3 kilometers before the Axis hit it full force with anti-tank guns and artillery. It's soon driven off to the northeast to seek refuge behind the Knightsbridge position and loses contact with the infantry. Now that they have no armor support, the Afrika Korps drives them back. The Sidra Ridge attack is called off after the 32nd Army Tank Brigade loses 50 of 70 tanks, a lot of them destroyed in an unsuspected minefield, and the whole offensive has now degenerated into disjointed local commands, with each division again having to fight its own private battle. It is now that Rommel counterattacks in force, smashing into 30th Corps and the 5th Indian and completely scattering the enemy, who can't reorganize until they're back to the Knightsbridge and El Adem boxes. They also push back the 22nd Armored, putting 60 of its tanks out of action. In fact, the Allies lose 218 tanks this day. The British official history will later state, communication and control broke down completely. And after that rout, today, Rommel deals with the 7 or so enemy regiments still inside the Cauldron, completely eliminating them, taking 4,000 prisoners, and taking all of the 5th Indian Division's artillery. David Braddock has criticized Neil Ritchie before, as we've seen, and he's again critical of the running of Operation Aberdeen. Rommel had prepared his defenses well, had taken full advantage of the collapse of Ritchie's plans, and the men of the 8th Army had once more suffered heavily because of their commander's inexperience. It is difficult to understand how, at this late stage, Ritchie was prepared to allow a vital battle to be fought by junior commanders with a command system that could never be expected to equal the efficiency of the strong personal control habitually exercised by Rommel. He was also seriously at fault in using 1 armored brigade, an army tank brigade, and 2 infantry brigades in Operation Aberdeen when he should have left his bases to look after themselves and concentrated every possible British formation and all the guns that could be made available to ensure the destruction of the enemy. Well, okay. Hindsight is fairly easy. But the chain of command issues are really hurting the British this week. That's pretty clear. But Rommel himself is also very critical of 8th Army. He does not understand why it did not attack in full strength, leaving 3 full divisions just sitting around. In his diary, he writes, "What is the use of having overall superiority if one allows each formation to be smashed piecemeal by an enemy who is able to concentrate superior forces on every occasion at the decisive point?" He will now focus on Bir Hakeim. Neutralizing Malta is crucial for Rommel to maintain his supply chain. But just the past few weeks, that neutralization has not been going so well. In fact, by the 31st, these Spitfires delivered to British Malta have been so successful in just 3 weeks that Luftwaffe commander Smiling Albert Kesselring now has only 83 operational planes. On the 3rd, 31 more Spitfires are flown in, 27 of them arrived safely. Now, back on April 30th, Adolf Hitler had promised generous German participation in the operation to take Malta, and had approved the plan April 18th, as we saw back then. But after Rommel's warnings that the 8th Army in North Africa had grown much stronger, he proposed that they take Tobruk first and Malta after, and Benito Mussolini had not objected. So joint planning proceeded, but the direct link between Kesselring's air offensive and invasion landings right after it was cut, which may well have saved Malta. On May 4th, an OKW directive set some independent German Malta plans in motion, but the German officers in Italy had other plans, and there was certainly no agreement on anything at all. And that is in fact still the case, even as Rommel is sure trying to make it as far as Tobruk. In other naval news, here are totals for the Battle of the Atlantic for May. Axis subs sink 125 ships for 607,200 tons of shipping. Because of the Milchkuh, milk cow supply system, there are between 16 and 18 U-boats operating off the American coast. 377 merchant ships have been sunk so far this year off just the American coast by U-boats. They are moving more and more often to the south, though, off Florida and into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The reason for that is that from mid-month, a fairly complete convoy system covers the U.S. north of Florida, as many British and Canadian ships are brought in to help out. And here are some notes to end the week. On the 4th, Reinhard Heydrich, director of the Reich Main Security Office, dies of the wounds he received last week. This is covered in more detail in the War Against Humanity series and in our day-by-day Instagram coverage of the war. His funeral and major reprisals will take place next week. On June 1st, the underground Warsaw newspaper Liberty Barricade publishes an extensive account of the gassings at Chełmno that we've seen covered briefly here, but to a much greater extent in War Against Humanity. The paper gets the account from Emanuel Ringelblum, who himself gets it from Jakub Grojanowski, who had escaped Chełmno in January after working there on burial detail. This report soon spreads westward. As Martin Gilbert points out, it has taken 6 months and 3 days since it began to be used as a mass murder site for it to be identified by name in the West. None of the other murder sites is yet known by name. Also on the 1st comes another 1,000-plane bombing raid by the RAF. This time they target Essen. On the 31st, a Japanese midget submarine breaches the Sydney harbor defenses and fires torpedoes at an American cruiser. It misses and hits the seabed below an Australian depot ship, Cuttable, sinking it and 21 sailors. That same night, more Japanese mini-subs attack Diego Suarez, Madagascar, sinking a British merchant ship and damaging the battleship Ramillies. And this brings me to the end of this week. Well, almost to the end. I have another regular episode that comes out tomorrow to talk more about the action in the Pacific. But there is a lot going on this week everywhere beyond the Pacific. Rommel looking better and better against the Allies in Africa. The Germans trying yet again to eliminate Sevastopol. And though I covered it the other day and not here, it deserves mention again. 2/3 of Japan's Kido Butai, their vaunted carrier fleet, destroyed. And with it, and for who knows how long, their matchless superiority in naval aviation. And it is now published in print and published by name what the Germans are doing. Sure, some people like British High Command have had some basic idea, but not about the actual process, not the organized nature of the systematic murder of human beings in the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and the millions. It's just one story, and it's hard for many to believe, but it is the truth. And it seems to me that if there is one story about one death camp out there, there may well soon be other stories about other death camps out there. Death camps. Whatever newspaper, in whatever part of the world is writing about them, it is going to be really hard to put a positive spin on those two words. I can't say it enough times, but our War Against Humanity sub-series and our Instagram day-by-day coverage of the war really do help flesh it out and give you a better picture of the nature of the struggle. You can check out the latest War Against Humanity episode right here, and there's a link below for the Insta. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Alfonso Lopez Fernandez. It is the army that finances all of these things, everything we do. So join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow.